Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Module 2 of Freight Forwarding Industry Major Stakeholders. We've got a number of focus questions that I'll be seeking to answer over the course of the lecture. They will be: why do shippers employ freight forwarders? Who are the key stakeholders in the freight forwarding industry? How do freight forwarders interact with these stakeholders, and what is the extent to which they interact with them? What are the main roles, responsibilities, and activities of customs organisations? What key factors are driving customs organisations to change and improve? And how are customs organisations working to achieve change and improvement? Our readings this week come from Branch, just a page in Branch, and a number of other readings that you can see there on your screen. So the first focus question that I want to answer today is: why do shippers employ freight forwarders? I've got that particular slide highlights a URL that you could visit to get a really good sense of why people use freight forwarders. It's an explanation of the types of services that are provided by freight forwarders. If you remember, last week we spent a fair bit of time talking about the main activities, the roles, responsibilities of freight forwarders. That encapsulates some of that particular information. And you can find a number of those websites available on the internet to get a better sense of the types of services that freight forwarders offer. Why use a freight forwarder? Well, one thing that I should say up front is that you've got a choice of using a freight forwarder or not. A freight forwarder is a service provider. All service providers, you have a choice of performing that service yourself, if you believe you can do that successfully, or you can employ somebody who can assist you or do that activity for yourself. So one of the reasons why exporters and importers want to use, or any shipper of goods, want to use a freight forwarder is because they're dealing with an unfamiliar overseas market. So they're quite familiar with their domestic market, but as soon as you go overseas looking for new markets, or you've identified a customer overseas, it's a different level of complexity. Complexity around the logistics, the import requirements, the transport requirements, the customers that you're dealing with. Perhaps there might be language issues. Another reason why you might use a freight forwarder is if you've signed a contract with somebody overseas and you've used the Incoterms CIP, CPT, or DDP. Now, the significance of those Incoterms are CIP, which is carriage insurance paid, or CPT, which is carriage paid to, and DDP, which is delivery duty paid, requires involvement of the seller in significant parts of moving those goods to that international market. So the seller not only has to package the goods, has to pay for the carriage and organise the carriage. They may need to cover the insurance, and with DDP they may need to organise all the import requirements of that other international country, and get the goods to a point in that particular country. So that's an additional level of complexity that might be a challenge for a shipper or an exporter. Also, it's worth noting that there is a level of complexity of shipping and customs arrangements. It's something that can be learned over time, but there is a level of complexity when you're dealing with documentation and government regulation that needs to be absolutely correct. Now, as an exporter, you might have a significant workload. Now, you may wish to focus on that workload of producing the products, making the products, whatever the product is that you have. So workload may encourage you to look for somebody who can perform that task on your behalf, particularly if you're a small firm. As a small firm, invariably, you're doing everything within the firm. You're the CEO, you're the marketing manager, sometimes you do the operations, you probably outsource the accounting. But you may be required to undertake the marketing of the product overseas. Now that's a task in itself. So if you could find somebody who could perform the logistical side of things, getting your product into the market, you might want to use a freight forwarder. Freight forwarder have got some key advantages, I guess, over and above doing it yourself, is that generally that they can access more favourable freight rates. And those freight rates often come from a scenario where they're providing a consolidation service. So they're grouping a variety of less than container load shipments into one full container load, which may provide you with more favourable freight rates. And that's something as an advantage. In addition to that, generally they have very good relationships with the carriers, and they are able to get a level of priority of booking cargo space on transport modes, because the freight forwarders ahead of time will seek to secure some cargo space going into the future. So if you use a freight forwarder, you can access that. And of course, if you need some specialist services, so if you need some warehousing might need to be done, some additional packing, well then you can use a freight forwarder. Of course, one of the issues around using a freight forwarder, so you're outsourcing it, there's a cost associated with that. You might have a situation where you're moving a significant volume of cargo, so you might want to consider your own shipping department. And that would be versus employing a freight forwarder. So you might want to undertake a cost-benefit analysis. So if you have your own shipping department, there's going to be capital expenditure, most likely for office space. You'll probably have to employ staff, you'll need equipment, and you want to balance that against the return that you're getting for that investment. Also, it would require you to have a significant volume of overseas business to really make it worthwhile on your behalf. Now, if you're just dealing with one particular export market, it might serve your purpose to organise that yourself or through a freight forwarder. However, if you are organising yourself and you have a number of markets, then you might find if those markets are quite different, that additional level of expertise might be required. However, if there's a level of similarity, that might lean you towards having your own shipping department. Of course, you've got to get or have available suitable staff to perform this on your behalf. So you've got to have enough tasks for them to be gainfully employed over a period of time to make it worthwhile for them to want to work with you and for you to want to employ them. The pattern of business and the degree of seasonal variation might come into it. So if your business is seasonal, then you might find that there might be half a year when you actually don't need a shipping department. And all of a sudden that becomes a less viable option. And ultimately it's going to be that financial appraisal that you need to do or undertake to ensure that it's actually really worth your while having your own shipping department. Now, should you have your own shipping department or not, you might employ a freight forwarder. You need to continually review the budget against the actual results that you're getting from your service provider, particularly in terms of price and transit times. So how competitive is your freight forwarder versus other freight forwarders who might be offering services? And you might wish to get a better understanding of that if you've got a number of customers or buyers that you deal with on a regular basis. You might want to check with your buyer to see how effective your freight forwarder is in getting the product there in the right timeliness, as well as being in the right shape and form. So it's got to be have no issues on arrival. And you might want to seek out your buyer just to see what the quality of service is of your freight forward on a regular basis. In addition to that, you also might want to monitor the profile of the freight forwarder. How viable is this particular company? Has it had any legal disputes, or are there any legal disputes? And those sort of issues might impact negatively on your the performance of the freight forwarder. Another potential option: most producers and makers generally have some access to an association. Usually there's many benefits from joining an association of your peers. You might want to speak to other traders about their experiences. So if you're shipping cherries, for example, you might want to visit another farm, have a talk to that farmer about how he goes about it. Of course, if you're dealing with a freight forwarder, it's almost a given these days that there is some level of technology used in that particular process. So you might want to ensure that your freight forwarder has got a level of technology. As an absolute minimum, you'd be expecting of a trace and track and trace type of an arrangement. Also, how is the company positioned in the marketplace, and what sort of liability insurance is maintained by that firm? So if something does go wrong with a particular shipment, how are you able to manage that based on the efforts of your freight forwarder? Ultimately, if you have got a freight forwarder in place, it's incumbent on you to ensure that you have an ongoing assessment of the quality of their service and the competency overall, because ultimately that's going to reflect on how your buyer perceives you in the marketplace. Okay, so the next question I want to look at today is, who are the key stakeholders in the freight forwarding industry? So if we have a look at, and that's just some of the freight forwarders, sorry, not freight forwarders, but some of the main stakeholders that freight forwarders are dealing with, shippers are dealing with, and so whether it's the port authority, the insurance company, whether they're transport companies, whether they're government departments, the shipping agent and the forwarding agent requires a level of liaison with those particular stakeholders. So if at any point those stakeholders aren't communicated with in the right manner, it's every possibility that the international shipment may not be successful. And so there's a number of reasons for the freight forwarder to ensure that there's liaison between all stakeholders. And that is because all parties involved in this particular international shipment have got a degree of interest in its success or otherwise. So whether you're an insurance company, whether you're a bank, there is a level of requirement for you to have an oversight in your activities, and the freight forwarder can assist you do that. They can advise all relevant parties in regards to pertinent issues, in regards to perhaps how the goods are distributed. It's also incumbent for everybody involved to ensure they're aware of government controls and that they comply with them. So customs regulations are quite significant, particularly if you're moving perishable products or products that have a certain amount of scrutiny. Also, it's important that you meet the requirements of various contracts. So we know that there will be a contract of carriage, there will be a contract of insurance most likely, there will also be a sales contract. So all those particular contracts need to be considered in the particular process. And of course, if you're dealing with selected Incoterms, those Incoterms, those international trading terms, are quite specific in terms of how that shipment is moved. So everybody needs to be fully aware of that particular information, as well as in situations where the movement of the freight shipment is a special operation. And you could call a multimodal transport a special operation that could be performed, which requires the involvement of all parties in some level of liaison. And of course, I mentioned before the various contracts. It's important that those contracts match the requirements as detailed for the bank. So if there's a bank involvement in the payment of goods, the bank is quite specific about what needs to be covered, particularly around things such as documentation. Now, if all those things are achieved, ultimately what we have is an efficient movement of an international consignment, which keeps all parties happy. Now, last week we spoke in a fair bit of detail about what the functions are of a freight forwarder. And as a export forwarder, there are many of the functions that they would perform. They might perform a transport distribution analysis. They'll certainly look after transportation. They may undertake packing and warehousing. In terms of an importation, there will be requirements performed by the freight forwarder, such as import customs clearance, any payment of taxes, etc. So to get an understanding of who the freight forwarder is dealing with in this process, we can look at the various contracts that are involved in the movement of an international consignment. And at the heart of those contracts, whether it's a contract of sale, a contract of insurance, contract of payment or carriage, the freight forwarder is at the heart of them. So to get an understanding of who the freight forwarder's major stakeholders are, we can do a simple mapping process on the functions against the various contracts. So if we take out the contract of sale, for example, and we map the functions, we can see that in the transport distribution analysis, the freight forwarder is going to be dealing with the shipper. If it's to do with transportation, including multimodal arrangements, the freight forwarder not only is going to be dealing with the shipper, but also the consignee. If it's packing and warehousing, once again the shipper. And we can work our way through there, mapping each of the various functions of the freight forwarder. If we look at documentation, the shipper's involved, the consignee's involved, the export office is involved, Chamber of Commerce is involved, customs are involved. So as we go through this particular process, it takes us to a point where we can map all those functions and build up a strong understanding of just who the major stakeholders that the freight forwarder is dealing with. And if we have a look at those interactions, we can see that the shipper is a significant stakeholder. Customs is a significant stakeholder, and consignees are a significant stakeholder, the importer at the other end of the buyer. Now, we can do that for all the major functions, If we looked at contract assurance, insurance companies, shippers again, consignees. So we're starting to get a pattern on who the major stakeholders are. If it's a contract of payment, with banks, credit unions, shippers again, consignees. So we're starting to build up a sense of who the major stakeholders. One point I want to mention in regard to the contract of payment. In many cases, the contract of payment is something that the freight forwarder is less involved in. Usually that's an involvement between the exporter and the importer themselves, those type of decisions. If we look at the contract of carriage, the ship owner again, airlines, trucking companies, customs again. So if we map that across the major parties there, we can see that the shippers are highly involved as a stakeholder in interaction with the freight forwarder. We can see that customs is highly involved. We can see that insurance companies and associated companies and brokers are involved. We can see that banks are strongly involved, certainly in the international consignment. And we can see that the transport modes are highly involved, and of course the consignee is involved. So that's in one way a simple process of going through to understand who the freight forwarder is dealing with as a major stakeholder in its interactions. So the next question that I want to look at and talk about is, how do freight forwarders interact with these stakeholders, and what is the extent to which they interact with them? So one method of looking at that is by virtue of looking at the various layers of interaction that the freight forwarder has. So we can use the logistics layer, which is the movement of the consignment from the seller to the buyer, to get a sense of how the other layers, the transaction layer and the government layer, interact with the forwarding agent or the freight forwarder. And we can see the freight forwarder there in the transaction layer having a lot of connections with other parties. And in the including customs, inspection and authorities. And it's in this governance layer that much of the interaction and stakeholder management on behalf of the forwarder is involved. And the main customs and inspection authorities are, as you would expect, the government department looking after them. So the Australian Border Force in Australia, formerly Department of Immigration and Border Protection, are overseeing all the consignments of goods that go out of Australia and come into Australia. And not only do they undertake this performance on their own behalf, but they usually collaborate or represent a range of other departments. There's over 20 departments that are interacting on goods and services that are moving outside of the border. Now, that particular governance layer also includes other agencies. So it's not realistic to think that the government can have complete empowerment to undertake all the activities given the level of and volume of trade. So they empower other issuing agencies to perform on their behalf. Now, a couple of those agencies are the AI Group and also the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry have a local commerce and industry in every state of Australia. And one of the main things that the Chamber of Commerce's do is that they look after countries of origin. So they provide authentication for Australian companies who are seeking to fill out the relevant paperwork for goods going into international destinations. There's also consuls and embassies that are involved in the governance layer, and also authorised officers. Now, authorised officers actually bring in involvement of the freight forwarder. So under the Export Control Act, a number of service providers are able to perform inspection and certification functions. If you consider that almost every plant or plant material that is exported out of Australia requires a certificate, referred to as a phytosanitary certificate, it's unrealistic to expect the government to be doing that. So they outsource this task to accredited freight forwarders, logistics providers, customs brokers, those type of people to perform that task. Even some shippers are able to perform their own export inspection and certification functions. Other governance parties in the government's law are port authorities and also river police. So if we have a look at the governance law, we've moved on from the governance law. Let's have a look at that transaction layer. So we've got the shipper is a significant party in the interaction with the forwarder, as we identified before. Banks and financial institutions, we identified before. Insurance companies, we identified earlier. There's depots where the goods might be delivered to, cargo carriers, of course, shipping lines, pipelines, perhaps not in mainstream, but pipeline is a method of moving commodities. Terminal operators, airports, rail, and shipping agents, and other services. So this gives you a sense of the level of interaction that freight forwarders are having as those goods move through that logistics layer. Now, one area that I haven't spoken in much detail about, and that relates to who the shipper is. So it's important for you to have a sense of who the freight forwarder may be dealing with and what services and who it's providing the services for. And it's typically providing those services for business. Now, business is quite a generic term. Another word might be firm, might be company. But typically, business could be a sole trader, for example. And that's the simplest form of business and relatively easy to set up. And the majority of companies that the freight forward is probably dealing with is going to be a sole trader, usually because they don't have the wherewithal. The freight forwarder might be dealing with a partnership, usually a grouping of 2 or more people, and there's a number of different types of partnership. The freight forwarder might be dealing with a company. Usually that's a separate legal entity, which is a lot more complex, arguably, than a sole trader and a partnership. Or the freight forwarder might be dealing with a trust. So it's just worth noting that when we talk about a freight forwarder providing services, well, he's providing services for those persons in the community, in the main, who are exporting their products, businesses who are exporting and businesses who are importing. Now, I've put in a couple of slides here that really are designed to give you a sense of who that shipper or who that company might be, who that exporter is. Now, I'm using the example which is closely associated with Assignment 3. So to get an understanding of who the major exporters in Australia are, this is the top 20, and that's also service providers. You note that freight has got its own area. When we look at the top 20 exporters, we can see that beef is one of the largest exports out of Australia. And that's going to be your task in Assignment 3, is going to be providing services to a beef manufacturer or producer. Now, to understand a little bit more about a beef producer, we can look at the overall exports of agriculture, forestry and fisheries. And what we can see there is that beef is at the top of the list and not far behind. And if we look at the top markets, the fourth largest market is the United States. So that's going to be the scenario that we're looking at for assignment 3. We also see that we've got meat products going in there. So meat and beef are quite significant export products. So who is sending that beef? Well, they're exporters. And as we know, an exporter is a business that sells its products to customers located in another country. So for the purposes of assignment 3, we're looking at you providing services to an exporter who's sending goods to the United States. And that gives you an indication of the size of that particular market, $389 million worth of beef going to the United States. So exporters of whatever product are the potential customers for freight forwarders. Why is that? Well, it's because they need various forms of transport and other services to ship their goods to the buyer in the international market. You may also be dealing with an importer in your own market. So Australia's top imports, which is one of the scenarios for assignment 3, you can see here on that list the top import sources. And if we look at electrical equipment, we can see that while it isn't in the top 20, it's just below the top 20 imports into Australia. And on this slide here, you'll also note that China is the top of the list in regards to imports. So an importer is a business entity that purchases products from suppliers in another country. So if we have a look at the market for Australian imports of China electrical and economic equipment, you can see that it's quite a significant market there. That will be the scenario for assignment 3. And so importers, once again, are potential customers for your business because they need to bring the goods from that international market into your country. Now, while there is very little marketing orientated requirements for this particular unit, I did just want to mention to you and just reinforce you, just a reminder that as a freight forwarder, if you're in that particular situation, if you want to gain customers who might be exporters, who might be importers, you will need to direct your marketing to the decision maker of the exporting and importing enterprises. So if, for example, you're marketing your services to a beef exporter, you'll need to make a level of communication to that beef exporter and put forward your how you can best satisfy their needs in regards to getting their products into that international market. And ultimately, you'll be using a number of aspects of your particular business to represent yourself and come up with that value proposition. That isn't part of the question, but just a reminder, just to be mindful of that, that a freight forwarder still is required to market itself to its potential customers. And one of the ways it might do this is by looking at the market for exporters and looking at the market for importers and putting those customers into a variety of groups. This particular segmentation puts customers into groups based on their user benefits. You know, what might be motivating them to ship their goods and whether the journey itself is urgent. So we can see here that there are a number of segments and subsegments that assist you to identify where your customers might be located. Now, this particular scenario lends itself more to air transportation, if that's how you're moving your goods. But it's just a reminder, and it's not part of the any testing or of this particular unit. But if you are a freight forwarder, you still have to undertake a marketing process to get your customers. Okay, so moving on now. We've spoken a little bit about the shipper. I wanted to give you a sense of who the shipper might be. I now want to talk in a little bit more detail about the customs organisations who are also a very key stakeholder. And I guess my emphasis on customs organisations is because it's probably not covered in many degrees in other units that you might be dealing with. So if you are dealing with a customs organisation in Australia, it's going to be the Australian Border Force. And there's been a number of government changes, mainly name changes over time. Department of Home Affairs, as I said to you before, were previously the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. The Australian Border Force, it's an independent agency under quite a large Department of Home Affairs, and they deliver the immigrations and customs border policy of the government. So the ABF is Australia's frontline border law and enforcement agency. So who are the Australian Border Force? Well, their mission is to protect Australia's border and provide and enable legitimate trade and travel. They've got a vision to be a global leader, and that's a very positive affirmation of them seeking to achieve best practice in what it does, and ultimately to build a safe, secure and prosperous Australia. And they aim to do this by facilitating the movement of people and goods across the border, working closely with other agencies. So as I showed before, there's 20 to 30 other agencies that Australian Border Force work with. So they want to share that knowledge, expertise and intelligence. And that's going to work in everybody's favour. And ultimately, they're underpinned by safeguarding Australia's national security. Now, when it comes to the responsibilities of customs organisations, in the main, they're implementing a wide range of management policies on behalf of government. So they're an instrument for government. Now, their responsibilities you could generally put into the category of traditional customs border organisations, and I guess the main one that stands out there is revenue collection. Now, when we talk about revenue collection in terms of a responsibility, it's overseeing the goods coming in, looking at the various tariffs and charges as the good comes in and collecting those. They need to ensure a level of trade compliance, also a level of facilitation. And facilitation in terms of customs is quite a positive word to use. It means that they're looking at the movement of goods through their borders in a risk management perspective. Other things that customs, in the traditional customs sense, they'll be trying to seek to intercept contraband, they're protecting the cultural heritage of Australia, and also seek to enforce IP, intellectual property, and trademark laws. And they do this not only on behalf of their own border management policies, but also on behalf of other government agencies. However, it's worth noting that the approach to customs is changing quite considerably. It's evolving over time with particular focus on that idea of trade facilitation. And as I said before, they're working with a range of government agencies to streamline the processes of moving goods across the border. So why is customs changing the way it's doing business? So what factors are driving organisations like the Australian Border Force to change and improve? Well, a lot of it has to do with things that we've probably talked about before and that you're aware of. It's the unprecedented growth of international business over the last 65 years. In many ways, businesses has amplified 500 to 1,000 times in terms of the volumes of goods going through the border. Also, there's a level of sophistication in regards to financial systems. So the more transactions there are, the more customs have to deal with. And in that particular context, in many ways, customs is dealing with the same resources that it's had to deal with for many years. So the growth of the customs department is not growing at the same volume that goods are as they go across the border. In addition, just to the movement of goods, we know that over time we've seen significant advances in transportation, which has amplified the volume of goods moving across borders. We're also seeing how bilateral and multilateral trading arrangements has changed over time. With the World Trade Organization, their overall aim is really just to drop trade barriers and make it easy to trade, and also to invest, and also to move services across border. So what we've seen is a proliferation of regional and free trade agreements, particularly between countries like Australia, who are very much a free trading economy. And this has been supported by collaboration with a range of multilateral organisations. So the World Bank, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization have all played their role into, increasing those volumes of goods across borders. E-commerce over the last 10 years has been a significant driver of the movement of goods, and the need for customs to recognise that the fulfilment, the customer fulfilment for e-commerce to actually work is a significant requirement of the process. And the e-commerce is strongly interconnected with modes of transport, and those modes of transport need to have an efficient fulfilment of the process, particularly when we consider that there's 20 million parcels moved by air alone around the globe. Currently, e-commerce is one of the shining lights as goods move around the globe at double-digit rate. And they still only represent a relatively small volume of goods that are traded. Another key issue that's driving customs from its traditional role is global value chain. Its factors of production are in a range of different countries. Countries are seeking to take advantage of cost advantages, access to factor endowments, and for that to work legitimately requires a very efficient movement of goods around the globe. And this shows the process of making the Boeing 787 and how the manufacturing, majority of manufacturing is offshore before it's finally assembled in the United States. So changes in expectations of the international business community has also been a strong point in driving change of customs. And much of that is because through the lobbying of the international business community, customs facilitation has been added to the World Trade Organization agenda. So all of a sudden, this has elevated customs movement as a key issue in the movement of trade. And that's had some significant, added significant momentum for change within customs agency. So when we talk about that, as I mentioned before, trade facilitation, it's this simplification, modernisation, and also harmonisation of export and import processes. And the reason why businesses have lobbied the WTO is a number of significant issues that they have a problem with traditional customs agencies, and that is that there's excessive government documentation. Often there's a lack of automation and the use of ICT, intellectual technology, information technology. Also, a lack of transparency over import-export procedures. So the ability for traders and service providers such as freight forwarders to get information from government is often difficult. Also, many customs agencies using a traditional form of control don't have any risk assessment techniques to make it easier for goods to move across the border. And also, most of the government agencies and customs agencies are acting as silos. They're not sharing information, they're not sharing documentation, there's no similarity or harmonisation in the documents that they use. So ultimately, what the business community was saying is that the negative impact on customs is actually on the economy is more than the benefits delivered by a customs agency in the traditional sense, and that trade facilitation is required. So I just wanted to finish off with a few slides just talking about how customs organisation work to achieve a move away from the traditional approach to more of trade facilitation. And they're doing a number of things. The first thing is that they've actually recognised that they are dealing with a totally different trading situation. And that for them to be successful in this role, they need to expand its scope to deal with this. Because in most cases, they're not given additional resources to perform this role. Also, that the new role isn't centred around collection of revenues, whereas the focus in customs in that traditional sense is to focus on collecting revenues. Rather, it's more about the movement of trade across the border to develop economic prosperity. Also, the customs role at the border is now regarded in a situation that they have to deal with all border transactions. And if they are going to deal with all border transactions, it's important that they have high level of communication, not only with other government departments, but also other customs jurisdictions. And that their growing role is more about administering the movement of trade rather than the collection of duties and taxes. So in addition to this, this taking on this role of moving goods across the border, does not mean that their traditional customs role is diminishing. They still have to collect tariffs. But as we know now, with a range of free trade agreements and multilateral trading agreements, that particular level of effort is less than it's been in the past. A lot of goods coming up across the border are tariff-free. However, they also need to be mindful that there are some non-tariff measures that they need to be mindful of. So if there is a free trade agreement between a particular country, it's quite likely that there's going to be a level of documentation to authenticate that those goods are actually from that particular country and that they actually get a reduction in their tariff. And of course, the protection from dangerous goods is an ongoing challenge for customs agencies. Now, a modern customs agency like Australia puts an emphasis on automation as well as risk management and intelligence. So usually they're dealing with modern IT solutions, real-time exchange, and taking a risk management approach. Now, when we talk about risk management, we're talking about a situation where they build relationships up with the importers and exporters to a point where a certain number of importers and exporters are able to move their goods through the border without any checks and balances because of the trust relationship between those parties. So this total control approach is the approach of a modern customs agency. So they've moved away from, as I said before, the revenue collection focus. And they're doing this as much as anything else to meet the changing expectations of the international business community, which ultimately has positive impacts on the economic development of that particular country. So my final slide is to look at scenarios where customs are evolving to meet this challenge. So customs agencies like Australia that I mentioned before have relationships with compliant private industry users, and by that we're saying with exporters and importers. And these exporters and importers are allowed to import with minimum intervention and oversight. And in that particular scenario, you would say that they fit into a high trade facilitation continuum. At the other end, and not all customs organisations are going to employ trade facilitations, you're going to have customs agencies that have a high level of control, suspicion, high levels of inspection, heavy levels of documentation, etc. Now, one of the tools that the Australian Border Force use is called the Australian Trusted Trader. And I'll post a link to that particular website. But it's worth having a look at how the simple approach that exporters, importers, and also their service providers such as freight forwarders can develop a relationship with customs agencies which enables them that minimum customs intervention and oversight. So that's all I'm covering today, and the focus questions I was seeking to answer: why do shippers employ freight forwarders? Who are the key stakeholders in the freight forwarding industry? How do freight forwarders interact with stakeholders, and what is the extent that they interact with them? What are the main roles and responsibilities and activities of customs organisations? What key factors are driving customs organisations to change and improve? And how are customs organisations working to achieve change and improvement? So thanks for listening. Hopefully next week my technical requirements in regards to recording in the classroom will be sorted out, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.